Hello and welcome back, friends. Daniel here with Doug Greene. Once again, Doug, welcome to the program. Doug came on last year to discuss his last book on Michael Harrington, which was a fabulous conversation, and I learned a great deal reading The Failure of Vision, which was, Doug, you did so many events on that book with different socialist groups across the U.S., and I think you should be proud of the impact that book has had, at least in starting conversations about the kind of short-sightedness of the realignment theory of Harrington, of how Harringtonism has become almost this well, I think we called it last time, you called it a spontaneous ideology of the American left. And Doug is a historian, Marxist historian based in Boston area. A great researcher. Today, we're talking about his new book on Stalin called The Dialectics of Saturn, Anti-Communism, Marxism, and the Fate of the Soviet Union. This is a tremendous work of over 300 pages. An immense amount of research has gone into this. It just so happens that our generation is once again dealing with the specter of Stalin in ways which can often surprise onlookers. Stalin is still a kind of passionate signifier that seizes people's attention. People still identify as Stalinists. There is a lot of historical illiteracy about Stalin that exists. Doug, we're sort of fortunate to have Doug on today. What I wanted to do, Doug, is invite you to be a bit of a historian and tell some stories a little bit, clarify some history for us, get some information correct. I think that's a huge part of what this book is about, is a question about the Enlightenment. It's kind of a sort of larger philosophical question about the meaning of revolution, what the historical context of Stalin signifies for our time, about our the way that we invest hope or optimism in the very possibility of collective liberation and revolution. Stalin actually perverts that. So I wanted to start, Doug, if we could, just asking you sort of why a book on Stalin, and why now did you decide to do this?
Well, first of all, thank you again for inviting me and for those very kind words. I'm very happy to be here. And in terms of why this book is, we can get into some, it actually originally started, it was going to be a joint project with my wonderful friend and comrade Harrison Fluss on Domenico Losurdo, but for various reasons, he could not participate. And I ended up originally starting to focus on Losurdo's work on Stalin, but as the book developed, it ended up becoming more about Stalinism and the Western Marxists, anti-communists, etc. on him. And I wanted to do a very quick shout out to Harrison, who it's dedicated to him, and he's a wonderful, brilliant philosopher and comrade. And his book, Prometheus and Gaia, is referenced in my book, and I know it's coming out in paperback next month. So that said, why Stalin? Well, first of all, I think every socialist and communist, whatever your tendency, whatever you adhere to, is you actually you take an opinion on a position on the Soviet Union and Stalin. So if you say you're a social democrat, that actually tells me what your position is to a broad degree on the Soviet Union. Or if you're a Maoist, it tells me, or a Trotskyist of whatever variety. So that's like a huge shadow, even among tendencies that completely reject the Soviet Union and Stalin. And, when I became a communist, which was back in the late 90s, I was and I still am, very attracted to Trotsky as this idea of an alternative to what had happened in the Soviet Union, as something more democratic, more revolutionary, more internationalist, among other things. And that idea of, if there is an alternative to Stalinism, an idea, or how the Soviet Union turned out, looms large in how we, in terms of questions of Stalinism, the possibilities of socialism. And to give you an idea, is the French Revolution, it starts off with these slogans of liberté, égalité, fraternité, and it ends in terror, the rise of Napoleon, etc., a new dictatorship. And a lot of people saw the same thing happen with the Soviet Union, and it seemed to be, is this written in the stars, basically? Is there something like some act of fate that happens? And it's certainly true that Stalin wins out in the Soviet Union, but it's not like there's some kind of genetic defect in the idea of socialist revolution. And part of what I tried to do in my book was to actually illuminate, the existence of alternatives and the deficiencies of and strengths of various analyses of Stalinism.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned the French Revolution, because one of the things that I think many people think about the Russian Revolution, they do have perhaps a kind of Orientalist view of the Russian Revolution. They think about it as a kind of immediate revolution from feudalism into communism, and kind of skipping over the liberal bourgeois part. But you actually show that in 1905, the Bolsheviks saw themselves as living out the kind of continuation of the Jacobins, and you call this Jacobin proletarianism, proletarian Jacobinism. And perhaps, Doug, we could start with that. That actually is interesting because, as we know, the French Revolution also sees itself, at least in the field of politics, as somewhat of a continuation of a certain movement of Enlightenment ideals. So instead of understanding Bolshevism as a spontaneous thing out of left field or bolt from the blue, you insist that the Bolshevik entry into world history should actually be thought of in concert with the French Revolution, as a historical sequence, that there's some continuity there. Is that fair to say? And can you explain how that works?
Sure. So the French Revolution, the very simplistic version, it's the rise of the bourgeoisie to power, the overthrow of feudalism, and in its most radical phase under Robespierre and the Jacobins, it's a revolutionary government that puts down the aristocracy and the counter-revolution and enacts a democratic constitution. And of course, it's supported by a mass base, and it has a guiding philosophy of the radical Enlightenment. And in the Marxist, scheme of history, that is a transition from one mode of production to another. And if you fast forward almost a century, Russia itself looks like almost in a similar state to the Bourbons of France. It's got this absolute monarch of the Tsar. It has this landed aristocracy entrenched in power. It has a rising bourgeoisie. It has lower classes discontented and are ready to rise up. And a lot of European socialists, people like Marx and Engels, they thought Russia was ripe for its 1789 and its 1793. And Russian socialists, Russian Marxists, the first ones, people like Plekhanov, who's the father of Russian Marxism, they expected, we're going to play the same role. We need this kind of revolutionary organization modeled on the Jacobins. We're going to lead a movement of the masses. And as Russian Marxism develops and gets more and more organized, you have a particular wing come out of that, which is the Bolshevik Party of Lenin. And Lenin himself sees the Bolshevik Party is taking the rational parts of Jacobinism, this idea of organization, a revolutionary Weltanschauung, a mass movement, revolutionary government in a party. And it's getting rid of a lot of the irrational parts of Jacobinism. It's elitism, etc. And it's important to note as well that Bolshevism, or proletarian Jacobinism, as I call it, it's a continuation and it's a development of earlier Jacobinism. It's not just, a complete replay, because the proletariat is a different class with different historical interests. And all the major figures of Russian Marxism, Lenin, Trotsky, Martov, Plekhanov, they all are drawing upon these Jacobin images. And in the 1905 revolution, according to the various schemas put forward, is Lenin sees the role of Russian social democracy as acting as Jacobins who would lead the charge against the old regime and establish a revolutionary government. And they would unite the proletariat and the peasantry, whereas others, like Plekhanov, are actually a little more conservative, and they want to just straight up ally with the bourgeoisie. And then you have someone like Trotsky, who sees the possibility of permanent revolution and socialism. And in the 1917 revolution, there's a constant looking for who's going to play what part in the revolution, because they all see themselves as playing the different roles in the French Revolution. Alexander Kerensky at various times wants to be Danton or Napoleon. Lenin is openly invoking, saying the proletariat looks to the Jacobins without fear. It's the bourgeoisie who is terrified of its own heritage, and we will pick up the banner, and Trotsky as well. And so everyone in the Russian Revolution at that time, they are wondering who's going to play the role of Robespierre, who's Danton, Marat, and all of this. And because the French Revolution is not only the revolution of the bourgeoisie, but it does provide this template, if you will, of what the sequence of revolution will look like in terms of its radicalization, its consolidation, etc. And after the Bolsheviks take power, they look for proletarian Jacobins to man their organs. So you have Felix Dzerzhinsky, who mans the Cheka that will use terror to put down the counter-revolution. Trotsky, in many respects, models the Red Army upon the French revolutionary armies. And of course, you have figures who are like, this is going to end the same way as the French Revolution, with like purges and dictatorship, etc. You see that among people who expect, who's going to play the Napoleon part. People like Martov are saying that. But it's also important to note that the Bolsheviks and proletarian Jacobinism is not about, again, it's not following the same sequence of the same ideas. For instance, the French Revolution does not abolish exploitation and oppression. It certainly gets rid of the old regime, but it establishes bourgeois power. The idea of proletarian Jacobinism, it's a true universal vision. It's about workers of the world unite. That's its a categorical imperative, if you will. And it's also about the communist age of reason. It's about getting rid of all exploitation and oppression. And I should add that figures from abroad, like the early French Communist Party would say, like the Bolsheviks, they know their French revolutionary history better than we do. Spanish communists like Andre Nin saw the Bolsheviks following in this Jacobin mold. And also Antonio Gramsci's ideas on the modern prince would eventually be informed by this idea of the Bolsheviks or the Communist Party being a kind of Jacobin style party. And so it's all these major figures of Russian Marxism see themselves as they see themselves as playing the various roles of the French Revolution, but in a different context, representing a different class. So it's not quite meant to be a replay, but it is also meant to serve as a source of inspiration, because according to Marxism, the next stage after capitalism is going to be socialism. So it's not going to just do what the French Revolution did, like line for line, etc. But it's not a heritage they renounce. It's one they defend. And in fact, there's actually, I don't mention this in the book, but one of the early monuments in Soviet Russia is actually a monument to Robespierre. It's either Moscow or St. Petersburg.
Yeah, that's incredible. And of course, the Bolsheviks, in a sense, do sublate, if that's the right term, the highest achievements of culture, of literature, of of philosophy in their own milieu. And Trotsky stands as somebody who thinks the sequencing from 1905 onward in ways that I think are extraordinarily robust. And it's no surprise that C.L.R. James would say, if you want to be a Marxist, he's saying this like in the 1950s. He says you have to read 3 books that are mandatory. Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, the 18th of Brumaire by Marx, and Capital by Marx. If you read those, you're pretty much good to go. You have your bearings straight. So could you talk a little bit about the importance of Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution? Why was it so exceptional in your view? Because there was many people that wrote about it.
I mean, there's a number of great works on the Russian Revolution, but I think what makes Trotsky stand out are a few things. First of all, he is, alongside Lenin, he's the central figure. So he's there for a great deal of these events and involved in the planning of the October Revolution. He gives some magnificent speeches. The other thing about Trotsky's history is he's just an excellent writer, and it's just very engaging to read. It doesn't feel like a book that is 1,300 pages long, and you can really get into it. It's often, I've heard it compared to like the Greek historians like Herodotus and Thucydides as well. And the other point I think I would say about Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution is it's not only the work of a participant and a great writer, but also a theorist of the highest caliber. He understands his Marxism. He understands all the intricacies of the class struggle and the different social forces at play. You get everything in his book, from what's going on in the court of the Tsar to what the countryside, the soldiers, and in the streets of Petrograd and Moscow, etc. And he really is able to tie this all into just a magnificent history that I would agree with C.L.R. James on those choices. There might be a few others I could add, but those are certainly essential choices. And yeah, Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution is essential. There are others like John Reed or Victor Serge I like as well, but Trotsky really stands apart from them.
Fabulous. So I think it might be an interesting time now to introduce Stalin into this picture you're developing here. Can you say something briefly about how Stalin first emerges within perhaps these sequence of events, and what his primary function and role is early on?
Sure. So Stalin is actually, like Trotsky, he's born in a national minority area, in his case, the country of Georgia. And he actually comes from a very low-class background. He is trained as a seminarian. And at a very young age, around his teens, he actually adopts Marxism and he becomes a member of the Russian Social Democratic Party. This is around the turn of the century. And very early on, he actually is a member of the Bolshevik faction, and he's organizing in Georgia, which it's interesting that Georgia is actually a section of the where Menshevism is stronger than Bolshevism, and Stalin is actually in a minority there. And Stalin, to be clear, he does organize, he does participate in the party, and he does go to jail multiple times. And as part of his activism, he writes. He's not a particularly profound theorist, although he does write a book on the national question, which later in the Soviet Union became one of the seminal texts, etc. But in terms of, by the time of the revolution, he's actually risen pretty far up in the apparatus. That's primarily what he is. He's like an apparatus man, a bureaucrat, if you want to call him that. And when the revolution breaks out, people like Lenin are in exile, and Stalin himself is actually in Siberia. He spent the whole World War there. But with the with the revolution, he travels back and he ends up actually in charge of the party in the capital. And it got kind of a little washed away in the Soviet period, but he was offering critical support to the provisional government and the war before Lenin returned with the April Theses. And during 1917, again, he's in the party. He's not a particular, wouldn't really call him a particularly distinguished role, but he's there. He's certainly not Trotsky or Lenin. And during the Civil War, he's involved as a commander at the city of Tsaritsyn, which was later renamed after him. It's Stalingrad, obviously the famous Battle of World War II. And he butts heads with Trotsky during the war over military and political policy. And alongside this, Stalin is also Commissar for Nationalities under the new Soviet government. And after the Civil War, Stalin himself rises to the position of General Secretary. He's appointed that, which is essentially one of the, it wasn't seen as this like all-encompassing position that it later became, but it was an important position in the party. There had actually been a few people before him who had the position, but Stalin was seen by many in the party as this efficient bureaucrat organizer. And that's kind of what he was known for. He wasn't a great orator or a great speaker, but he was seen largely as this efficient organizer by a lot of people in the Bolshevik party.
And he was also a theoretician to some degree. He wrote.
We can debate it if we want.
He had a scholarly proclivities and some scholarly skills. I mean, especially because it is interesting as a side point how Stalin did make certain interventions, even within the field of philosophy and linguistics, which I think, based on the kind of tyrannous basis of his rule, tended to be like the impact of his scholarship tended to be way overblown. But nonetheless, he was a theorist. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So there's the major work pre-revolution is actually Marxism and the National Question, which he certainly wrote with like the influence of Lenin, but it is his clear work, and it actually informs a lot of Marxist debates to this day on nationalism and the national question. And if you were to look at in the United States, for instance, among Black nationalists who are like inclined to the left, that's often a reference point. When I took politics of nationalism in college, Stalin's work on the national question was actually the first thing we read. And there are some criticisms that you can make of it, but it is a reference point. The other major work I would say, and this is after the revolution, is a book called The Foundations of Leninism. And what that book, it's actually a series of lectures he gives in 1924. And it's kind of like is what codifies for the Soviet Union anyway, and most of the international, communist parties, is the codification of Marxism-Leninism. It's the one that wins out. There are others who offer their own, different interpretations, but Stalin kind of codifies it, and it's actually, it's constantly reprinted among people who are more pro-Stalin or Maoists, etc. That text is a very essential point, and there's also kind of an interesting thing in like an early edition, he denies the possibility of socialism in one country. It's actually a very good quote. And in later editions, that gets edited out to say, yes, we can have socialism in one country. The other, he in the 30s, he writes a little book that's part of the short course on the history of the Bolshevik Party called Dialectical and Historical Materialism. And I forget if it's like 20, 30, or 40 pages, but it's meant to be kind of this concise summary of dialectical materialism. I have a lot of theoretical issues with it, but it was people like Eric Hobsbawm would use it, and a lot of people in the mainline communist parties would refer to that text to understand what dialectical and historical materialism was. And he also had some, towards the very end of his life, like you said, he had some stuff on linguistics. He had a book called The Economic Problems of Socialism. That might have been the last text he read, kind of looking like where the Soviet Union is going afterwards. But so those are some of his ideas. There's also, he's kind of the co-author of it, which is obviously, it figures heavily in my book, of the theory of socialism in one country as well.
So tell us, Doug, about the schism with Trotsky. You already alluded to it a second ago, but obviously Trotsky became a scapegoat, and affiliations with being perceived to be a Trotskyist, or a sort of a bourgeois nationalist or a fascist, was grounds for being purged, being murdered, being taken away by Stalin's police force, which were brutal, no doubt. How did this schism emerge, and how did it become so exacerbated, so kind of hyperbolic, so intensified?
Okay. No, it's a great and obviously an important question. So Trotsky and Stalin had known each other since before the revolution. They didn't particularly like each other, and they'd obviously had butted heads during the Civil War, but they were in the same party, etc. What really starts to diverge them is after the end of the Russian Civil War, the country's exhausted, the Soviets have kind of withered, and power is being increasingly concentrated in the party state bureaucracy. And Stalin, as general secretary, is essentially becoming the focal point of that. And there's kind of early signs by like 1922, 23 of an embrace of great Russian chauvinism. And another issue that that kind of divides them will be later Stalin's idea that Russia can build socialism in one country in absence of the world revolution. So there's this privileging, if not in theory, but definitely in fact, of Russian or Soviet interests over those of the world revolution. And Trotsky is a very orthodox Marxist on this question, who privileges the international aspect of the revolution. And he is opposed to the bureaucratization of the Soviet state. And I go through a lot of like the specifics of like the various programs on offer, but he is opposed to this bureaucratization and wants to restore power to the Soviets, and has different ideas on agricultural collectivization, and does want to privilege the international aspect of the revolution. And that eventually leads to open factional fighting in the Soviet Union. And by 1927, Trotsky is actually purged from the party, and a few years later, he's exiled. And this is, Trotsky himself becomes this focal point for Stalin because, first of all, he is an immense figure. He was one of the leaders of the revolution and the Red Army, and he led the most vocal struggle against Stalin. There were others who did oppose Stalin, but not as consistently as Trotsky. And the other thing that really, I think, draws Stalin's ire is the fact that Trotsky, if you read, his various programs of what exactly, he's offering, he actually offers a very consistent, coherent, revolutionary Marxist alternative to Stalin. And for someone who's the head of the Soviet Union, which Stalin is, and seen as like the spokesperson for Marxism among many people, both pro and anti-communist, this idea, there's the challenge of Trotsky as, against the revolution betrayed, as he says about Stalin, is almost an existential challenge. And as the 30s go on, you have, basically upheavals of industrialization and collectivization. And there are people within the Communist Party in the Soviet Union who are questioning what Stalin's doing. And there are, the fear of opposition and the fear that Trotsky could take advantage. And this, I'm making this a little more simplistic, but by the mid 30s, Trotsky has become this great demon, this great boogeyman. And every opposition in the Soviet Union is attributed to him. He's attributed to be in league with Japan and Nazi Germany and all this and he's basic. And when they have the great show trials, and there are 3 of them in the mid 30s, Trotsky is essentially the unnamed co-defendant in all of them, and he is sentenced to death and murdered. But Trotsky represents for Stalin, this challenge, this revolutionary Marxist challenge. And obviously, as part of Stalin does not want to obviously see Trotsky in that way. So Trotsky is portrayed as a fascist collaborator, a bourgeois nationalist, a Menshevik, a reformist. Because I believe it's said in the foreword to my book, if you see Stalin as a hero, as this savior, then it becomes much easier to see Trotsky as an antichrist, as this demonic figure. And that's certainly, if you read any of the literature put out from the Soviet Union of the 30s or the various communist parties of that era, Trotsky is this hideous demon. And if you notice, there's actually little to no engagement with any of his concrete ideas. It's just like, oh, he's this anti-communist, anti-Soviet. He wants to overthrow Stalin and bring fascism to Russia. And it becomes this fierce battle. And it's not just a battle of personalities, although that element is certainly involved, but it is actually a battle of programs.
Yep. Yes.
So this idea, because if you don't accept Stalin and you're looking for a Marxist alternative, well, Trotsky's actually offering one. He actually has it laid out.
Battle of programs for how the transition of the revolutionary sequence is to go. And one of the ideas that Trotsky puts forward is the idea of cultural revolution. I wanted to invite you to say something about the importance of cultural revolution for Trotsky, because it is sort of an implicit, if not direct, critique of the way that the Soviet Union under Stalin was going in some sense. And I'm curious if you can elaborate a little bit about that idea.
Sure. I mean, cultural revolution is obviously most famously associated with Mao Zedong and the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in the 60s, but Trotsky has his own view. And I should add, he's actually just kind of sees himself as following in the footsteps of Marx and Lenin on this question. Because if you actually read I believe the Communist Manifesto, Marx says, we envision the communist revolution to be not just a change in property relations, but also a radical change in ideas. Because if you want people to change the world and to the working class to run things, then they can't have medieval ideas, elitist ideas, bourgeois ideas. They need to be able to think for themselves. They need enlightenment. They need modern culture. And Trotsky is looking at the Cultural Revolution, which, again, Lenin is advocating some of that in his final writings, that we need modern industry. So first of all, we can provide abundance for people. It's necessary to develop the productive forces. But in order to have the proletariat rule society, they need to shake off medievalism, feudalism, all these unenlightened ideas. And it should be noted, Russia is, serfdom is barely a generation away. So Trotsky had this idea that if the working class undergoes this cultural revolution, which will mean egalitarian relations between men and women, with national minorities, adopting enlightened ideas and internationalism and universalism, it will shake off like all of this backwardness. But it's not just seen by itself. It's part and parcel of the whole project of industrialization and reinvigorating the Soviets so that the workers can rule. Because if the workers are going to run things, they need to have modern ideas. They need to be enlightened, have modern culture. And part of the Cultural Revolution is, attacking like all these kind of backwardness and reactionary ideas. And so it's part and parcel of his whole program to do that. And it's also for, the work in the cities, in the countryside, for men and women, etc. And that is part of the Cultural Revolution as he sees it.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I wanted to also ask you, which I found very compelling, Trotsky's notion of social fascism and the way that Stalin was propagating social fascism. So could you perhaps sort of define what he means by that concept, and even how it was associated and with the rise of Nazism? Can you explain that for us?
Sure. Well, social fascism is not a concept that Trotsky originates. It comes from Stalin in the Comintern. And to simplify a bit, it's basically arguing that social democracy is imperialist, reformist, and is basically the moderate wing of fascism. And they were looking to places like Germany, Austria, etc. And this had originally been forwarded in the early 20s in the Comintern. Might have been by Zinoviev. Stalin picks it up and he actually says, social democracy and fascism, they're not opposites, they're twins. And in the late 20s into the 30s, Germany is entering the Depression, and there's the rise of the National Socialists, the Nazis. And the Communist Party of Germany basically sees the social Democrats as social fascists, and they refuse to ally with them. Now, to be fair, there is on the other end social democrats who refuse to ally with the communists. And what Trotsky is saying is that there should be a united front formed. And the idea of the united front is not to coddle the social democrats, not to excuse the reformism, but to defend these institutions of bourgeois democracy against the rise of fascism. And the Communist Party should make principled efforts to do that. It should try and win over the rank and file, because the German KPD, the Communist Party, they didn't just attack the leaders of the social democracy, many of whom, did deserve to be attacked, but they would go as far as attacking school children as social fascists. And this kind of left the German working class movement disunited, and Hitler kind of came to power without a shot being fired. And Trotsky is saying, he had been warning for years that some kind of united front should have been formed. And it wasn't. In fact, after Hitler came to power, the Communist International said, you know what? The German Communist Party made no mistakes at all. They did everything right, which is kind of ludicrous if you think about it. So Trotsky sees that the rise to power of Hitler is a historical test. It shows like the Communist International has failed to analyze this event correctly, that the theory of social fascism is a part of it, and it kind of shows its bankruptcy as a revolutionary organ.
Yeah, that's very helpful as a precursor to the notion of the United Front, which we can revisit in a moment. I think it's important to note that what we're about to talk about, what I want to turn to in a moment, is the meaning of Stalin as seen by people outside of the Bolshevik movement. But it's also, I think, useful perhaps to note that the Bolshevik Revolution was a world historical event which fundamentally brought a increase in the egalitarian standards of the Russian people on a kind of unprecedented level in many different areas of social life, right? The promotion of mass literacy, the promotion of economic betterment, the rights for women and gender was, I was just reading a huge, because I'm a scholar of the family. Well, the Bolsheviks brought so much egalitarian improvement to the family structure, which was globally had never really even been seen, even in much more advanced capitalist societies. So it's very tragic that Stalin reversed so many of those gains. Perhaps you might say something about those gains, though, just to begin on a kind of optimistic side, because I do think that there's something that is betrayed So what was betrayed? What was achieved? Perhaps you could say something to that.
Sure. I mean, I look at the Russian Revolution, and it's the first time outside, say, the Paris Commune, where workers take power, and they show that an alternative to capitalism and class society more generally is possible. And however long you say they ruled the Soviet Union, it happened, and people could look to that for good or ill, as that's an alternative. And it survived, for 74 years. And obviously it inspired revolutions elsewhere in China, Cuba, Vietnam, etc. And it gave an inspiration to the anti-colonial movement, to the anti-fascist movement, etc. And you're right, there was obviously advancements for women. In fact, for the first almost 20 years of the Russian Revolution, like, homosexuality was legal. It was actually rolled back. There were these wonderful experiments in terms of, like, artwork, how are people gonna, like, have family life. There were all these experiments in communal living, and it's pretty inspiring, a lot of that early stuff. So by, like, the mid 30s especially, there's a reassertion of the traditional family, of patriarchy, nationalism, which gets increasingly chauvinistic, etc. And obviously, there have been, like, the usurpation of power by the bureaucracy in the Soviet Union that shut, like, the workers out from, effectively ruling things. But there were these genuine advances, I obviously, you can read the book, but there's a lot of criticism to be made about, the Soviet Union in World War II. But defeating the Third Reich, it was a good thing. I'm very glad that happened. And this, in the 50s, the Soviet Union put the first, it started the space race and helped, defeat apartheid South Africa. These things happen, and they are certainly inspirational, and they're worth defending. There's all kinds of criticisms, obviously, about how consistent they were with a lot of this, how the bureaucracy did not follow through and kind of did not defend a lot of things. But even if, for instance, even like reform struggles, like the struggles in the United States for the New Deal and for civil rights, etc., they had to respond to the Soviet Union, because workers and oppressed peoples be like, what, they are, they're this alternative, and we kind of need to concede, etc. Some kind of concessions, reform concessions. Otherwise, people will become communists.
Absolutely. Yes. And even, of course, Stalin pressured the United States and pointed out to the hypocrisies about the US's model of freedom, which, of course, was reliant on the massive oppression of Black Americans, which at the time also included lynching. Still, right?
Yeah.
So, let us before we talk about how different prominent thinkers, because your book is about how prominent thinkers have understood the meaning of Stalin. Before we get to that, tell me about Lenin's views on the split between Trotsky and Stalin. And of course, this is expressed in his testament, which is his deathbed note regarding his vision for the future. And Stalin concealed this, but actually Max Eastman published in the New York Times, which I always think is so funny and interesting. Not only that document, but can you just talk generally about how you think Lenin saw the split between these two major figures?
Sure. I mean, first of all, Lenin had known Trotsky since, like, the early 1900s. He'd actually been involved together with Lenin in Iskra, which was, like, one of the initial journals for the Bolsheviks. They had split over. Trotsky did not side with the Bolsheviks, and there had been a lot of polemics between Lenin and Trotsky. We shouldn't deny that. But long story short, in 1917, they pretty much have come together politically. Lenin welcomes Trotsky into the party, gives him a lot of responsibilities, including helping to organize the seizure of power, running the Red Army. And he does work closely with Trotsky. He also does work closely with Stalin, because he helped make sure that Stalin is Commissar of Nationalities. But in the early 20s, when one thing Lenin takes very seriously is this idea of nationalism, and not for the Soviet Union should not like perpetuate great Russian chauvinism and the domination of particular nationalities, for instance, Russians over like the other nationalities which had been oppressed by the Tsar. And Stalin had been involved in a very severe altercation with Georgian communists. I believe him or one of his colleagues had like physically assaulted them. And Lenin was aghast at that. It went against everything he believed in. And he also was aghast at the increasing concentration of power into Stalin's hands. And there was also an element that Stalin had been like personally rude to his wife, Krupskaya. And by this point, Lenin was in very poor health, and he dictated what became later known in his testament, where he offered like his assessments on various party members, including Trotsky and Stalin. He does say that Trotsky is inclined to the administrative side of things, but he says this is the most capable person in the Central Committee. And in one of his letters, he says that Stalin should be removed. He's too rude. He should be taken out. He shouldn't be general secretary anymore. And he actually enlists Trotsky to present his case to the Central Committee, which I'd argue is a failing. Trotsky does not do, and Stalin is not removed. And as the factional struggle in the Soviet Party heats up, like you said, the testament is actually released by Max Eastman, and Trotsky is publicly denies it, which kind of hurts his case a bit. But it is actually after Stalin's death or in the Khrushchev reforms, it is like admitted that this was real, and you can actually find it, in the post Stalin Lenin's collected works. But also in Lenin's testament, he's developing ideas on cultural revolution, on how to maintain the worker-peasant alliance, and how to start reinvigorating like the Soviets. And I would argue that Trotsky is essentially picking up the baton from that and kind of carrying it forward as time passes.
So let's move now to understand a bit about how Stalinism is perceived as a sort of betrayal of the egalitarian possibility of what Bolshevism first represented. Can we start with Winston Churchill and the frankly quite racist Judeo-Bolshevik sort of view that he held on Stalin? That was a big part of how he saw it, right?
Mm-hmm. So it should be noted that for people like Churchill, and they don't really see Stalinism, they're just talking about communism. So they would include Trotsky in this. They don't have a materialist analysis of any of this. They are not interested in class struggle. They see communism, revolution as a virus, a contagion that will destroy healthy societies. And this had originally been, with like the development of modern medicine, like reactionaries really picked up on this idea that revolutions are viruses. And particularly among its far right adherents, the source of the virus was seen as a subversive Jew, or just the Jews in general. And Churchill, he picks up on a lot of this, and he sees the Bolsheviks as a subversive Jewish virus. And he sees things like fascism as a healthy antibodies against the bestial appetites of Bolshevism. And although he does actually praise the purges of the 30s for removing Trotskyists and like other communists, he says they're getting rid of these internationalist Jews and it's becoming more nationalistic. But Churchill himself has no great insight into the Soviet Union or communism or Stalinism. He just sees it as a subversive virus.
Right. So it makes total sense why socialism in one country would be a better adversary, possibly even ally, which in some cases obviously it was, not only to fight fascism, but on the scene of the capitalist world market, whereas the Trotskyist insistence on permanent revolution and a more cosmopolitan insistence on expanding socialism is clearly going to be much more of a threat for a Western statesman. Can you talk about not only Churchill, but some of the other prominent statesmen in the U.S. And perhaps even in France? Did they basically share the same view?
Yeah. So in France, in the 30s, there was an increasing class struggle. There had actually been an abortive fascist coup at one point in 1934, and a lot of French reactionaries they hated, like, they saw the local Communist Party and obviously the Soviet Union as this subversive enemy. And when they actually had a Popular Front government in 1936, it was led by a moderate socialist named Léon Blum, and French reactionaries said, better Hitler than Blum, or to put it more crudely, better Hitler than a Jew. So to them, they wanted to defend private property. They wanted to defend the French nation against these subversive Jewish virus. And in the United States, it really picks up after World War II, but you see people like Whittaker Chambers, who's one of the great founders of modern conservatism, and he sees communism as like, it's this idea of, that man, like the religion of man against God, it's showing the possibilities of man, and like it's subversive, etc. He's not quite as anti-Semitic as some of them, but he does see it as this subversive secular virus, from Satan himself. It was first manifested in the Garden of Eden. And if you were to watch like any of like the they're actually funny but not funny, the anti-communist propaganda put out by the US in the 50s, they describe like Herbert Philbrick, who is like an FBI informant, he describes as an international criminal conspiracy. Joseph McCarthy, there's no engagement with communist ideas. It's just a subversive virus with tentacles everywhere and everything. It's cartoonish, but obviously it had real world effects.
Yes. Totalitarianism is thrown around a lot after Hannah Arendt's work on this concept. And I want to invite you to talk about how this notion of totalitarianism kind of first enters in as a way, in part, to describe both Hitlerism and Stalinism simultaneously, and to also conflate them as a sort of way of distancing them as otherized versions from us over in the West who apparently possess capitalist freedom, etc. I thought that your analysis on that was quite interesting. Can you explain how totalitarianism comes to be associated with Stalinism?
Sure. So before the Cold War, totalitarianism is kind of a term that's up in the air and up for grabs. So it's actually initially used by anti-fascists in Italy to describe Mussolini, who actually takes it up and says, you know what, I'm totalitarian. It's a good thing. Some Marxists like Trotsky uses it in Revolution Betrayed, Victor Serge, other critical ones. Franz Neumann, the Frankfurt School theorist, uses it to describe Nazi Germany, but it's kind of up in the air. It's like really not codified. But when you actually, after 1945, with the Cold War picking up, the Soviet Union is very quickly seen as the new enemy. And totalitarianism is codified by people like Hannah Arendt as this all-encompassing state that suppresses, humanity. It reaches into people's souls. It's like all-powerful. The masses are enslaved. She sees it as a product of mass society, and she ties it to Nazi Germany as well. And that's because the totalitarianism had gone back and forth. During World War II, it was impolite to describe the Soviet Union as totalitarian, whereas you could describe Nazi Germany. Afterwards, it's a way to conflate them, to say, like, listen, we're picking up the struggle. We fought the Nazis in World War II. Now we're fighting the Soviets, and they're both totalitarian. And it should be added, like, Soviet studies really doesn't exist in the United States before 1945. there are certainly people who are writing on it, etc. But with the Cold War, you have massive government grants, private foundations, purging of any radicals that do exist in academia. They're kicked out. And Soviet studies is an impoverished, theoretically, if you were to read those people at the time, people like Adam Ulan, like their understanding of Marxism is comical, but they are getting government funding. They have these chairs at major universities, and they're able to propagate this idea of the Soviet Union as this all-powerful totalitarian superstate, and that is out to conquer the world and institute a reign of godlessness, etc., and enslave humanity.
So let me ask you, on the concept of totalitarianism, how would you use it, and when does its application have sort of coherence, according in your view, or do you actually not think that it's a useful construct?
I actually don't think it's a useful construct at all. I understand why people were using it at the time, etc., but this idea of a society is like frozen with like essentially history ends is just I hate to use this phrase, but undialectical. It's society's change, developed. That idea of total control really never existed. Totalitarianism has served more as an ideological weapon of anti-communism, is what I call the Cold War counter-enlightenment. It's meant to discredit not just Stalinism, but also the Soviet Union, communism in general of whatever variety, and to discredit reason itself as the source of communism.
Yeah, let's move to that. And since we're somewhat going chronologically, I do want to invite you, Doug, to say something about the very important moment, which, just for listeners to our program, we just had John Bellamy Foster on, which I think you saw the interview on, Lukács's irrationalism. And of course, one of the things that he really helped us with is understanding the historical context of the Korean War as reinitiating a cycle of imperialism, which for many Marxist intellectuals in the West, I would actually call it kind of like a PTSD moment, theoretically, because they didn't want to see that the capitalist system, its vortex was bringing us back into an imperialist cycle. But it was. And in fact, as it was getting off the ground, you have something called the Congress on Cultural Freedom emerge, which was an anti-communist kind of full court press that the US government tried to coordinate by enlisting former communist intellectuals who had kind of turned their back on the communist cause and equipped them as sort of on the front line, right, to combat communism in different ways. And we can name some of those people, and I want to invite you to do that. If you could tell us about this. I think it's not talked about enough in accounts of American history, of American radicalism, American politics, etc., how important this Congress on Cultural Freedom really was.
Yeah, the Congress of Cultural Freedom is it's essentially the ideological Cold War, and it's funded directly by the Central Intelligence Agency, and it's meant to combat communists, the left more generally, on the terrain of culture and ideology. And it's bringing together people who had been formerly Marxist of one sort or another: Sidney Hook, the pragmatist philosopher; James Burnham, a former Trotskyist and a CIA operative; Arthur Koestler, the author of Darkness at Noon and a former communist; John Dewey, the liberal pragmatist. He was involved in the founding convention of the Congress of Cultural Freedom. And there were many others. And it was, interestingly, the Congress of Cultural Freedom held its inaugural meeting in West Berlin in June of 1950. And the date is important because around the very time the meeting was held, the Korean War broke out. And they were actually at the meeting saying, we're almost expecting the Red Army to move in. They thought World War III was on the horizon. And the Congress of Cultural Freedom was insidious. It went on for, I believe, until like the 60s, until it was finally exposed. But they were funded, the CIA was funding journals. It was engaged in these kind of ideological weaponization of culture politics, philosophy, etc., where it could. And they enlisted all these prominent intellectuals. I mean, they were serving like the arm of like one of the most brutal institutions of the 20th century, which was the Central Intelligence Agency. It was, in my mind, it's very little different than working for the SS.
Yeah, I found your conversation on Koestler interesting. He's an important figure when it comes to Western perceptions of the meaning of Stalinism. And I want to invite you to talk about him. But one of the things I found really compelling about Jean-Paul Sartre in that milieu is that he was in fact invited to participate in the Congress on Cultural Freedom, and he turned it down, in part because he was wary about the Korean War starting, for which he also differed with Koestler, as well as he differed on that with Maurice Merleau-Ponty. They both strongly differed on that. Merleau-Ponty was a kind of liberal who flirted with the communist cause for a brief moment, but you show that he was actually pretty much was a coward in the face of the Korean War, and the Western left really fell in line with the imperialism at that moment. What makes you? Why do you think that was? It's sort of an embarrassment, the way that all went down. How do you make it?
I mean, the Western left, was variety. First of all, like leaving aside, well, the mainline socialist parties for decades had given up on the goal of socialism in practice. In fact, NATO was founded in 1948, and many of the founding parties that were to it were socialist or social democratic parties in the West. And a lot of Western intellectuals, the post-war prosperity had kind of started to kick in, and that certainly de-radicalized some of them. Some of them were so horrified with Stalinism that they essentially saw Stalinism as the only evil in the world, and they just let go of any opposition to Western imperialism, etc. So all of and we shouldn't discount the fact that, of the power of propaganda, the fact that the bourgeoisie can just pump all this out and eventually people succumb to it. Koestler himself, he was a brilliant writer, I think. I really enjoyed writing his sections, and he had been a member of the German Communist Party, and he wrote Darkness at Noon. He was obviously involved in the Congress of Cultural Freedom, etc., and he had done talks with members of the CIA about it. And Sartre himself is, he's a fellow traveler. It's really with the Korean War that he really kicks in to actually become more actively politically involved. Something called the Ridgeway riots in France, where there had been protests against like an American general who was coming there to take command of NATO. And that really solidifies his political commitment. Whereas, like you said, Merleau-Ponty, his book on Stalinism called Humanism and Terror, I actually think it's probably the best philosophical defense of Stalinism. It's actually certainly worth reading. But with the Korean War, he kind of figured, you know what, the wager on communism, on Stalinism, whatever, it's over. We've got to abandon this and just kind of look for some third way, some other way to do it. So It's kind of interesting where him and Sartre just kind of went in opposite directions with the Korean War.
Well, so you've mentioned Merleau-Ponty's book on Stalinism, and it is quite compelling. And one obviously wishes, in a sense, that he didn't give way to this kind of Marxist Pascalianism. Maybe he's a sort of a lesson in the dangers of Marxist Pascalianism in some sense, which I want to actually ask you to summarize his book there on Stalin, because he sees it as this sort of form of historical necessity, right?
Yeah, so in order to talk about this, Arthur Koestler writes his book Darkness at Noon. And the book itself is about the show trials. It's a fictionalized account, and it's about this one defendant named Rubishov, who's an old Bolshevik, and he's protesting his innocence. But at the end of the book, he essentially comes around and he says, like, I'm going to confess because I need to put if I don't refuse to confess, I am not serving the party. The party represents history, the interests of the proletariat, and I need to perform this one last wish for the party. And this was, Koestler's arguing that the Stalinist idea of historical necessity, that they're serving the will of history, is this terrifying totalitarian logic. And it's, it was very compelling. It was a bestseller in France after World War II. And Koestler, after World War II, has kind of moved to his most left. And he's one of France's most prominent intellectuals. And he responds to this book. And there have been other people who responded to it. Someone named Roger Guérondi in the French Communist Party had. But what Merleau-Ponty does in his book Humanism and Terror is he recasts the debate a bit. He's saying it's more a Pascalian wager, and he reinterprets the confessions at the trials to say, like, people like Nikolai Bukharin, who was one of the most famous defendants, he was an old Bolshevik, they willingly confessed because they saw themselves as Marxists, and they did not want to objectively, they may have accepted that they were subjectively innocent, but objectively that their opposition was bringing, the possibility of counter-revolution, and therefore that they did not want to do that. So they sacrificed themselves. And so Merleau-Ponty thinks like this, he doesn't say it's all necessary, but what he does say is we can't know right now. Things are still open, because remember, this is 1945, 46. And the battle is still going on. We'll know when this, he actually uses the example of the French resistance. You can't judge them whether they were right or wrong until the battle is over, until the war is over. So when I actually think it's a bit arbitrary, but he says, you know what, if the Soviet Union launches a war of imperial expansion, etc., then we can kind of judge the wager on Stalinism to be over. But he for the moment, he says, like, the verdict has not been decided, and he still wants to, he's still waiting for the coin to land. But he's saying, if they actually reach communism and socialism, yeah, it would have all been justified. Everything they did, all those, all the trials, the purges, etc.
So let's talk about the show trials very quick, just for the benefit of listeners. So they happened for 2 years, and ostensibly they are a kind of a grand performance on the international stage. Can you just sort of give us a little bit of an overview there?
Sure. I mean, there were 3 major trials, and they were former prominent leaders of the Bolshevik Party. There have been other people purged, but these former comrades of Lenin, underground revolutionaries, they're admitting to outlandish conspiracies that they were involved with intelligence agencies in Germany, Japan, etc. They were confessing to it too, as well. And most of them were subsequently shot afterwards. And what made it so famous is the fact it's not just these prominent figures, but it's the fact that who are on trial, is the fact that they're confessing to these outrageous crimes. So for a lot of leftists, in abroad, it's like, were all these people traitors? Some of them just accepted it at face value at the time because they didn't know any better. They just didn't think the Soviet Union would lie. But it calls into question for a fair number of people that, maybe, is Stalin actually the traitor to the revolution? But it also does bring up this whole idea: is our revolutions destined to eat their own children as well, which is obviously the title of my book as well. But
yeah, and it's interesting because in a sense you say that most of the prominent Marxists that most of us, say in the United States, are aware of under the rubric of Western Marxism, and here we can talk about Lukács, Gramsci, Adorno and Horkheimer, Marcuse, and others. You really combine their orientation, their view on Stalin, and you say that they actually share a lot in common, as seen from a certain perch, so to speak. And I wanted to, because I felt that was useful, the way that you the way that you did. And obviously they differed quite a lot.
Yeah.
But there is a kind of, let's call it a kind of shared inadequacy about addressing the realities of Stalinism. And I know that obviously these are each very singular thinkers, right? We could spend a whole podcast just on Lukács's relationship to Stalinism, right? Or Gramsci's, which is fascinating. And I love each of the chapters of your book is really nice because so much research has been done on each thinker. But for the benefit of this interview, Doug, can you kind of come at it from a slightly higher angle and sort of summarize how Western Marxism, and just define that for us, kind of erred in their treatment of Stalinism, if that makes sense?
Sure. I mean, Western Marxism is it's generally a school. It's not really a coherent school of thought. There are like currents in it, with like the Frankfurt School is the most famous, and they are not always, but generally outside of the official communist parties, and they tend to focus more on questions of culture, ideology, and philosophy than, say, politics and economics that a lot of more traditional orthodox Marxists do. And so you have within the ranks of Western Marxism, you obviously have like Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, Lukács, Gramsci, Hobsbawm, Bertolt Brecht. And some of these people are incredibly enthusiastic supporters of Stalin, like Ernst Bloch in the 30s. Others are not, like Marcuse is certainly not. He really doesn't share those illusions. But on the one hand, there is this idea, like, we see the Soviet Union as on our side. It is this bulwark of anti-fascism. It's dealing with the future. And some of them really agonize how to deal with it, like the purges. Like Bertolt Brecht, I think, is genuinely like really torn about how to understand all of this. And he's constantly going back and forth. And on the one hand, you do have people who are enthusiastically embracing, the Soviet Union, and they have no doubts. Others who are torn, others who pull farther away, but in some ways, they're not really able to escape this idea that Stalinism was essentially, there was no alternative to it. It was essentially inevitable. Even Marcuse, who really doesn't share those illusions, if you read his book on Soviet Marxism, he kind of sees it like that. And the way they and it's very, there's questions on what they argue for as a way out of Stalinism as an alternative. Marcuse just kind of hopes, especially towards the end of his life, like some kind of libidinal revolt from like the outcasts of society. Walter Benjamin hopes for some kind of apocalyptic event. Adorno and Horkheimer essentially just retreat into academia and quietism. So there's really unsure of what to do. And, Lukács, he hopes, towards the end that there can be some kind of reform from the bureaucracy, which doesn't happen. But all these figures, and they are very diverse in them, and there were plenty I could have covered but didn't. And they really are not able to escape. At least the ones I covered were not really able to escape this idea that Stalinism was historical necessity, even if like they could oppose it in some profound ways at times.
Yes, and I felt that your conversation on Gramsci was helpful. You mentioned that Gramsci contains a lot of ambiguity in the thrust of his work. His work is incomplete in a lot of ways, but that allows for a sort of abuse, interpretive abuse, hermeneutical abuse of his material. And I think that's pretty self-evident that liberals can kind of roll with it, for example. And we see that even in our own time, right? But could you talk a little, because I found that your section on Gramsci and Stalin was quite, I learned a lot from that. Could you talk a little bit and go into a little more detail on Gramsci in particular?
Sure. I mean, Gramsci, leader of the Italian Communist Party, brilliant intellectual, actually been an important influence on me as well. And he's actually one of the few people I covered in that section who has actually worked with Trotsky in the 1920s. And Trotsky had actually wanted Gramsci to kind of be in charge of the Communist Party of Italy and to support the United Front. Now, Gramsci himself was not a Trotskyist. He was not a supporter of Trotsky. He did admire a lot of his writings, but when he became a leader of the Communist Party, he was a loyal party man, and he was facing opposition from the famous left communist Bordega, who's actually supporting Trotsky. So Gramsci doesn't want someone to split the party, which he does see Bordega doing, and Trotsky in the Soviet Union. But Gramsci is kind of concerned, particularly before he's arrested, about the methods that Stalin is using to fight the opposition. It should be noted that Gramsci supports, the Stalin and the party in the Soviet Union, but he doesn't like this character assassination, these bureaucratic maneuvers, and he actually writes a letter to the Soviet Communist Party saying, we in Italy, we support you, but you shouldn't be doing these kind of methods to deal with the opposition. You should try and bring them into the fold, etc. Others in the Italian Communist Party did not want to even have those reservations. Togliatti, who ended up being the post-war leader, saying, no, we should just support them and not bring any of these issues to the fore. But this letter is kind of delivered or is written around the time Gramsci's arrested, and he's essentially taken out of active political life, and he's in jail, and his health and body are destroyed by the fascists in Italy. And he, on the one hand, he doesn't like the Communist International's third period, and he's not expelled like a lot of, Togliatti actually kind of just won't expel him because Gramsci is a martyr for the party, etc. And other party members in jail, though, kind of ostracize him. But Gramsci, to keep his mind alive, he follows events. He writes his famous prison notebooks. And like you said, they're incomplete. I mean, he's in jail. He doesn't have access to all the sources. And the fact is, he's writing under the literal guide, under the eye of the fascist censor. So he is kind of critical of certain elements of Stalin and the Soviet Union and how they dealt with the opposition. But and there's question again. It's like we cannot give a completely definitive answer about what his final opinion would have been. If you were to read the prison notebooks, pretty much all his opinions on Trotsky are negative. It's kind of interesting. He attributes Trotsky to positions he doesn't have, like opposition to the United Front, which is ironic because Trotsky is actually telling him 10 years before, adopt the United Front. And he does see Stalin as, this more a politician who's adapted to the national context of Russia, etc. Stalin's actually not really discussed much in name. So there is some kind of evidence that he knew about, like the purge trials, which was happening like at the very end of his life, and he kind of was questioning like the innocence of the defendants at that time. But in terms of Gramsci's final view, it's like he was a loyal party man. Does that mean he was like this unthinking Stalinist? No, he didn't like the type of character assassination, bureaucratic maneuvering. And it would be hard to say what his final view is, but he was definitely in that mold, and so that's kind of where I come down.
It has a lot of resonance, even with a Lukács or even a Bertolt Brecht, and Brecht himself was pretty loyal, if not loyal, pretty much the entirety, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people maybe neglect that because you can't have the liberal civil society kind of Gramscian hegemony, NGO, Ernesto Laclau, post-Marxism with a Gramsci who has sympathies with Stalin. Like those don't work for the. Anyways, it's a bit of a contradiction, which is fine. Talk about the theory of Stalinism as a bolt from the blue. And this whole line of conceptualizing the meaning of Stalinism.
So this idea comes from the Marx's introduction to the 18th Brumaire, where he's looking at how people were viewing the rise of Napoleon. And he said there were people like Victor Hugo who see Napoleon as just kind of appearing out of nowhere on the stage of history, this mediocrity as a bolt from the blue. And the whole idea of the bolt from the blue is it's essentially how opponents of Stalin or Stalinism, anti-communists, I should add, are looking at Stalinism not as the result of material factors, not as the result of class struggle, not of any of that. It's just kind of this demonic force that just appears as, and they try, and I look at three ways that they kind of use it. One is like the idea that, the Judeo-Bolshevik contagion, this disease, Big Brother for George Orwell, and this idea of totalitarian reason that you kind of see with the Cold War counter-enlightenment. That's where they see the roots of Stalinism or communism. And I should add, for like the anti-communists, they don't make the distinctions that we on the left do between Leninism and Stalinism and Trotskyism, etc. They just see it as all this singular like contagion, this virus.
Yeah, I mean, in a funny way, I'm thinking here of like how the mainstream Democratic Party under Hillary Clinton saw Trumpism, right? It's like, oh, well, Trumpism shouldn't be understood in relationship to like deindustrialization and like the evisceration of, right? Like it's out of the blue. It's an aberration. We can sweep it under the rug, right? This doesn't point to a deeper symptom, right? Do you find anything at all compelling about the literature from this perspective as it pertains to how they understand Stalin? Or do you think that it's sort of just, and even like an Orwell, right, who has, at times he has some maybe interesting insights here and there, or do you find it just methodologically idealist and flawed?
That's a great question. And the first thing I'll say is like, I don't think we should adopt like anything what these people say about, it's not materialist, etc. But the one thing I do find interesting, and this is especially true when I was talking about like the Cold Warriors, the people, like Solzhenitsyn, Richard Pipes, the Black Book of Communism, Jacob Talman. One thing that they were able to do is they understood in a way like the roots of communism and the radical enlightenment. They understood like the power of reason, of monism, the importance of Spinoza and Hegel. And it would just kind of struck me in a sense, like they understood what to attack. Like the really smart ones, people like Leszek Kolakowski, who wrote Main Currents of Marxism. In that sense, I actually found them very compelling because I think actually conceding ground on those questions, on monism, on the Enlightenment, on philosophy, Hegel, Spinoza, etc., are actually things Marxists should defend. And, we shouldn't concede ground to the anti-communists. We should actually defend our philosophical ground from them.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I always like to, this is an important thing, I think, also when we look at how Marxist ethics should be regarding working with reactionary thought, right? My interest in Nietzsche, Heidegger, but even Kolakowski, who is a liberal, but he has done his homework on Marxism. He knows the tradition better than most Marxists, and he's not necessarily a liar, right? I mean, he's somewhat of a trustworthy interlocutor to an extent. So therefore he's a good opponent, right? And I think that we often perhaps lose sight of that, the value that could come from learning from one's enemy, so to speak. So I do agree with that. Although of course there's a lot of caveats and sort of limits involved with that, nonetheless. Victor Serge is a fascinating figure, tragic. I was just meeting with somebody who had recently immersed themselves in Victor Serge's literature, and they said that when they were done, the feeling that they had was demoralization, right? Because they said that, well, he paints a picture of how all of the good people, right, were systematically taken out, so to speak. And so he's an interesting figure who kind of documents Bolshevism from a pretty early point throughout. So he's sort of a journalist. He's sort of an ideological outsider, right? Do you trust him as a writer on the Bolshevik experience and especially on Stalin?
I mean, Serge himself is a fascinating figure. Like your friend, like I've read Serge, I've immersed myself in him. I love his novels, etc. On the one hand, he is an outsider. He's subsequently like an anarchist, a Bolshevik, a Trotskyist, kind of this independent Marxist, a social democrat by the end. He does write like year one of the Russian Revolution when he's pretty much firmly in like the Bolshevik camp, which I liked, and he has insightful, character portraits in like the case of Comrade Talayev, his famous novel on the purges. I do trust a lot of like that particular, like his novelistic accounts, even like as he moves farther away. What I do have problems with is like you said, like there is this demoralization in Serge. By the 40s, he's essentially in exile. He's left Europe. He's living in Mexico. He's in desperate poverty. And he is succumbing to a lot of political pessimism, and he moves very close to this Western orientation. It's not complete. He kind of dies before it's totally figured out, but he's essentially becoming a cold warrior, a premature one. He sees, Stalinism as this great threat, and he's even, he's not supporting like the Viet Minh against the French, and he's coming out with pro de Gaulle stuff, and he embraces certain ideas from James Burnham on the managerial society, which are very anti-communist. So he always has this certain nostalgia in Serge for the Bolsheviks, for that early period, which he does maintain through his life. But in practical politics, he's a social democrat. It's not quite figured out in the same way as, say, Max Shachtman or Michael Harrington, who are complete cold warriors, but he's well on his way. That's not to say, like, again, I love his writings. I highly recommend them to anyone. And that includes like the writings where I disagree vehemently politically.
Yes. Very interesting. Before we get to Stalin as it exists as a sort of political weapon, football, sort of ideological form in today's discourse and today's political climate, you and I both share a fond admiration, it must be said, for Domenico Losurdo's work, with one exception, which is his book on Stalin, which I've only read in parts. Quite frustrating work, actually. Does take the point that you made earlier about some of the opening that Stalinism allowed for, especially in the developing world, the so-called third world, and takes that as the impetus for a grand defense of Stalinism in ways which you take to task in your book in the appendix. That's what the appendix of the book is dedicated to. Why did you choose to focus on Losurdo? And how do we preserve, there's a two-part question, how do we preserve Losurdo as a great Marxist historian? Because you see a lot of people want to, you see, Doug, it's a bit of a danger, right? Because we don't want to discard his other works. He's a profound scholar. He's written a number of great important works on Hegel and Nietzsche and liberalism, on Kant, many others, class struggle, etc. So how do you separate that out, if that makes sense? So that's sort of part two, but what made you want to address Losurdo?
Well, originally the whole book was supposed to be about Losurdo. It was supposed to be talking about his relation to Western Marxism and the communist movement, etc. But as it developed, it became more about Stalinism generally, and Losurdo essentially became the appendix, because he originates the phrase "Dialectics of Saturn." So I did want to keep him in it. And like you said, like Losurdo is a great scholar. He's written magnificent works on Nietzsche, liberalism, Hegel, all these wonderful books. And I think with any figure, and this could be including like the other figures in the main text I did, is you can draw a balance sheet of these people. You know, they made contributions. You know, Brecht may have apologized for the show trials, but you know what? He was a great playwright. The same with Jean-Paul Sartre had his dalliances with the French Communist Party. He was also a great novelist and a playwright. And Lukács, he had his compromises with Stalinism. We shouldn't overlook that. But I don't think it mars actually his book on The Destruction of Reason or The Young Hegel. And the same can be said about Losurdo. But you know, if we're
or W.E.B. Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois is a long,
yes, Du Bois is another one. You know, there's
great
all
example.
these. And it's like, you know, we'd have to like discount like a lot of the historians of the French Revolution, the Marxist ones anyway, who were like either members or affiliated with the French Communist Party. If you draw the balance sheet, you can, you know, pick out the strengths and weaknesses.
And you're also playing into a kind of stereotype that was invented by people like Arthur Koestler in their work like The Yogi and the Commissar.
Yeah.
Where you sort of create this vulgar typology, right, of like a Stalinist as a kind of abstract psychological version, right? And this actually still persists today, which we can talk about in a moment. This framework of thinking like Stalinism as a virus, which has certain traits and which must be purified. So, anyways.
Sure. I mean, with Losurdo himself, I mean, Losurdo comes out of a tradition of Western Marxism, and he also was active in Italy's communist parties, like several of them. And he wrote famously a book called like Stalinism, Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend, and a bunch of other articles where he's essentially defending Stalin as like necessary to stabilize the Russian Revolution, to put, you know, to have like this pragmatic realism. And interestingly, though, he's probably more a Dengist than a Stalinist, because he's also using the same line to defend Deng Xiaoping and the market reforms in China post 1978. But if you actually read Losurdo's book on Stalin, it's not defending, like, say, the Soviet victory in World War II, or it's not just doing that. It's saying, like, Stalin played this exceptionally great role as a military leader. He defends the purge trials more or less as like a traditional Stalinist from the 30s, that, you know, Trotsky was involved with these conspiracies. He overlooks like a lot of data, and he defends even like the anti-cosmopolitan campaigns that were conducted at the end of the 40s. And he just sees this as historically necessary. And he, you know, when he talks about Trotsky, it is in this vein as like this, you know, this universalist, almost this romantic figure who's not willing to understand the dictates of realism. And the thing with his whole claim on Stalin is like, I think he just doesn't, he's not willing to understand like how this damages the cause of socialism in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. Like, he will excuse like a lot of the Soviet diplomacy and in the run-up to World War II in a way that just overlooks the clear mistakes that were done. He defends the military purges. And I feel like if you actually like look into the history, like he's just, it's not, a lot of his specific claims are just not supported. You know, this goes for like the military purges, the purge of Bukharin and others, and his understanding of Stalin's relation to the colonial world. Because there were, especially in the 30s, there were clear sellouts. The French Communist Party was defending the French Empire along the lines of the Popular Front. The U.S. Communist Party was cozying up to FDR as part of the Popular Front. And Losurdo is not willing to actually interrogate like how that kind of flows from this privileging of Soviet interests over the international interests of the working class.
Yeah, I've never understood his work on Stalin in relationship to his work on liberalism, as well as his own commitment to rationality. It doesn't compute for me, but there are, I think, the notion of balance sheet is an important one when assessing any thinker, especially from the turbulence of the 20th century, right? Which certainly had political upheavals in ways which we have, but which are much more muted in consequence, perhaps, than that time. That draws me now to the question regarding, and I asked you actually to read this recent piece, which has been making a bit of noise on social media from Current Affairs, which is a sort of a thorough takedown of Stalinism. Wanted to see what you thought about that article, but I also wanted to ask you if you have thought much about kind of the meaning of Stalin as in today's time. What do you see as, are there any common kind of characteristics of Stalinists that you see as sort of, because one of the things the article speculates on, they make a kind of speculation that we can say that Stalinism is people for whom social democracy or other left-wing channels seem ineffective, weak, maybe feminine. There's a whole gender issue going on there with Stalinism. Can Stalinism be thought of like that for you? Do you ever think about it that way, almost as like as a kind of psychological type that people are drawn to, if that makes sense? Have you thought about a theory of contemporary Stalinism in this way?
Not quite. I mean, I'm not really. So the article itself was, there were some true points certainly about like the social conservatism in the Soviet Union. I didn't really appreciate the glib dismissal of Trotsky, but what have you. But in terms of, there certainly is, like, if you were to look at like one of the appeals of like Stalin in like contemporary Russia is this idea of like the strong man, who restored Russian greatness, etc. And it's really not even a defense of like Stalin as like a socialist, which some people obviously do. But that's obviously, like the legacy in Russia. In like Western countries like the United States, like I would imagine, some people are like fed up with social democracy and democratic socialism, and they should be. That's fine. But in terms of looking for an alternative, they look at something, the malign figure of Stalin. And certainly there's a lot of like anti-communist stuff around that. But they kind of do the other extreme and they just say, well, Stalin did nothing wrong or something like that. And certainly you see a lot of that online. And there certainly is this idea of posturing. And it is also like attached to like a defense of like a very uncritical defense of like contemporary China, etc. Because they see that as an alternative. But it really in certain sense, I'm not sure like what the practical politics are, because like at least in the United States, like the figures, like the organizations that identified most with Stalin, like the Communist Party, at its heyday was very popular frontist. It was very reformist. And a lot of these organizations do that. There is obviously the offshoot of Maoism, which is, I mean, there's certainly overlap, but I would argue it is distinct. And they are, fighting guerrilla wars. But, this is different. You do have like the internet phenomenon is a little different than like an actual like practical organization. Like organizations I might describe as Stalinist, like they might be out in the streets and doing X, Y, and Z. They may be reformist in other ways, and we can judge that based on the organization, etc. But a lot of the internet stuff, I mean, I don't think a lot of it's super serious. A lot of it, I mean, I do see some of them just like it's very unscientific when you're like defending like some of like the contemporary apologists of Stalin and like really not looking into like a lot of the historical literature. I'm not even saying you should look at Trotsky, although you should. It's really just not Marxist and not materialist. Like you often see like Losurdo's name comes up and everything. And I think a lot of these people just want someone who's going to confirm their faith. And if we're Marxists and materialists, we really shouldn't have that approach. Again, we do need to draw balance sheets on people. And I think the internet personalities, I see them on my Twitter feed, and I just don't take them super seriously, to be honest.
Yeah. No, I don't either, but I do think that the suggestion of the current affairs article that Stalin, well, one of the things that worries me is that the signifier of Stalin is used often in liberal circles as a way to militate against communist radicalism. So, I mean, we saw this recently, for example, with the work of a scholar called Gabriel Rockhill, who I don't know exactly how he associates himself with Stalin. I think he is sympathetic to Stalinism in a kind of contemporary way. One of the things that is interesting, though, about that is that, or one of the things rather that concerns me about the current affairs approach, let's put it this way, is that they too end up kind of ending up with a certain pessimism, right? They end up falling into the dialectics of Saturn, right? Like, you see my point? So
Yeah.
it becomes a kind of, I don't want to call it anti-politics, it's an anti-communist position. So how do we get around that? And here we might introduce some of your solutions in the kind of conclusion of your book. But yeah, how might we move beyond that strange sort of fetish of Stalin, or that strong rejection of Stalin, or even Doug Henwood has mentioned this time and again, which is on the American left, it seems that the American left almost always needs a kind of fake specter, or like, let's call it a nominalist specter of Stalin, perpetually. So how do we fight that tendency on the American left? Let's talk about the American left and its fixation on Stalin as well.
I mean, there's a few things. First of all, it's like this Stalin as a demon is no more helpful than Stalin as a savior. Those approaches are anti-materialist, they're very mystical, they're very religious. And I'm simplifying a bit, but we should reject both of them. On the one hand, it's like we do need to combat anti-communism. Like people like Robert Conquest, Ernst Nolte, the Black Book of Communism, those are ammunition directed against any attempt at revolutionary change. So we actually do have to interrogate and debunk their claims. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to embrace like the apologetics for Stalinism, because those, as I argue in the book, don't actually lead to socialism. They end up hampering the socialist project. And in drawing this we should understand like this idea of bolt from the blue has its mirror image in the historical necessity. People who are rejecting, anti-communism and, all like the capitalist propaganda, and they embrace uncritically Stalin, it's not super helpful. It's not super materialist. And part of that is, I think, going back to Marxist basics, going back to revolutionary Marxist program, etc. And I think it does mean going back to Trotsky's analysis of Stalinism, which does avoid the kind of the anti-communism of the Cold War, and also the type of crude apologetics. And it does offer a materialist analysis of Stalinism based in the class struggle and the materialist conception of history. And understanding that Stalinism is not like our fate, whether for good or for ill, that alternatives did exist. They existed in the Soviet Union. And if it doesn't, our fate as, if we envision socialism as the next stage, we're not fated to have a Stalinist outcome, not necessarily. There are all alternatives. And that actually does mean having a real understanding of historical necessity, not the kind of pseudo one that I think like people like Koestler were advocating, but a real one that means going back to revolutionary philosophy, the radical enlightenment, all of that. And again, regrounding and putting a red flag on the field, essentially, based upon
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I also think that the question of fascism needs to be thrown into the mix here, because I've seen a lot of historians say in assessing whether fascism is a real phenomenon in today's time, they say, well, one of the reasons for the camp who says that it's not, they say it's not because we have a waning and a kind of less visible workers' movement and socialist party presence, and that fascism is so you see, but then the implication of that view is that if we were to construct that, they sort of shoot themselves in the foot, right? Because so the argument would have to be something like, yes, fascism is going to exist in both scenarios, whether the work it's not contingent on the workers, the strength of the Workers' Party. It's not a natural bastardization of that, right? I think that that's a really bad kind of liberal telos to look at it that way, but people do look at it that way, and of course also that socialism and communism are more serious about addressing fascism would be an important thing to note there too. So I wonder what you think about that notion, because even a lot of we have this whole big debate on Foucault, and look, I mean, if you read Foucault, he does somewhat associate Stalinism like with the workers' movement, or rather with Marxism, right? And with historical materialism, and with a kind of natural outcome of Marxist historical materialism, which sanctions him and others to sort of say that, well, we can intellectually and theoretically also abolish it, right? So it's not in a direct conflation between Stalinism and like Marxist thought, but it gets close to that with a lot of these thinkers, and that really concerns me quite a lot. And I hear you saying that this is the last thing that you want to come of this, and then you also have, of course, here I'm not just opening, I'm just bringing in a number of threads. You can respond as you wish, but I'm thinking here of Zizek's thing, which kind of is annoying in my opinion, because his whole position on Stalin is that we, the left, should be the ones to make the balance sheet on Stalin and tell the truth on Stalin, which of course, I think that's fine. But when you push him on that, he doesn't quite seem to be able to make the kind of separations that you're making about how to understand and maintain let's call it an optimism to a revolutionary possibility that the Bolsheviks did open, if that makes sense. He still sort of succumbs to what I would call a kind of pessimism. I know you don't study Zizek in this book, probably because he hasn't written enough substantively on it to do so. But could you respond to some of these things that I've just mentioned there, perhaps?
Sure. I do talk a little about Zizek in terms of Brecht, but interestingly, the best thing I thought Zizek has written that dealt with Stalin or the Soviet experience was actually his introduction to Trotsky's Terrorism and Communism. And there's actually a wonderful blog article by our mutual friend Harrison Floss called The Prophet avec Lacan, which kind of gets into the weaknesses of Zizek's perspective. I mean, as much as I disagree with Zizek, I think the point is well taken that it should be the left or the Marxists who make the critique of Stalin and Stalinism. I mean, I have a number of problems with someone like Foucault, but he's really not qualified when he's embracing neoliberalism or the Iranian theocracy, and he's condemning Stalinism for authoritarianism, etc. I mean, come on, man. I mean, that's just ludicrous. And when we come to understand fascism, etc., I mean, I think in terms of like contemporary society, someone once put it to me, and it might have actually been Harrison again, but any analysis you have of fascism is also analysis of bourgeois society. Like if you think that fascism is just something that can be defeated every 2 to 4 years at the ballot box, that's a little different than saying the only way to get rid of fascism is to abolish like the private ownership of the means of production through a proletarian revolution. And I think like contemporary Stalinists or Marxist Leninists are really not super helpful on a lot of that. The last thing I did want to point out is like I actually have learned a lot from Rockhill's pieces, both on the Frankfurt School and on Zizek. And with him, it's, you know, you're right. Like people are using like his very uncritical, like I think, support for like contemporary China, and he's maybe like rose-colored glasses on his views on Zizek or the Frankfurt School. But if you're drawing a balance sheet on someone like Rockhill, I mean, yeah, that those elements do exist, like his defense of Stalin or contemporary China certainly appear in his work, but I'm not sure if it quite undermines the arguments if you're drawing that full balance sheet on his work. And that's something, again, and with Zizek, I mean, I feel like a lot of his remarks on the Soviet Union and Stalinism, it's like, there's certainly like his remarks on like Soviet cinema, like, you know, Stalin is like, I think he said like the big other in some of his pieces, like taking the Lacan. But I just don't feel like it's like really a super coherent view, and he jumps all over the place. Like at times, like you said, he says like, oh, we should on the left should make the critique, but then he says like, you know, Stalin was like more like worse than Hitler, or it was like something like that, and it's just like, I don't know, pick a position, man, and stick with it.
Yeah. Well, actually, Harrison has an essay on his intervention, which was the introduction to Trotsky's.
Yes, that's the one that's the one I referred to.
Yes. Which Fluss is quite critical of Zizek's there, yes?
Yes, he is.
Yes, of course. Yeah, that's interesting. Yes. Well, this has been really stimulating. I've kept you for close to 2 hours, Doug. Has there been any points about the book? When is the date by which people can acquire the book? When is its official release?
I haven't got my author copy yet, but Amazon says it will be out on March 31st. I'm told some people who ordered it from the publisher are shipping soon, so I would guess within a week you can get it. And if I know
it's going to be reasonably priced.
It's in hardcover, so it's a little on the higher side of the price scale. You can get it on Kindle, and I would suggest I'll let you know about a paperback release. I don't know about that currently, but you can also get it at libraries as well.
Okay, great. No, it's an incredible work. I do want to get a physical copy of it for research purposes, because something that I can refer back to when I'm working on certain thinkers, especially in the Western Marxist tradition, which I study, to understand their, you know, relationship to Stalin. That's one great thing about it. And of course, the other great thing is I absolutely share your core premise about let's call it the kind of wider ideological impact that Stalin has had on the left that still persists to this day and needs to be overcome. I think your book is one attempt in that direction. So congrats
Thank you so much.
For sure on it. And I hope that folks, is there anything that you've been dying to mention that I may have neglected, given how massive the book is?
It's a lot of vignettes, so I go over everyone from Orwell to Hitler to Solzhenitsyn to Jacob Talman, Hannah Arendt, Isaac Deutscher, Eric Hobsbawm. So there's a lot of people in the book. It's not just like, it's not so much biographies. I like the vignettes is how I'm describing it. I guess this is an announcement, but I have a forthcoming book. I just finished it like a week and a half ago on Kautskyism. So that's a different angle, more along the lines of Harrington, but a little different.
Our friends at Cosmonaut are not going to like that comparison.
Maybe not, but they're wonderful friends. But yeah, I have my criticisms of Kautsky.
Oh, well, that will make a great conversation and debate. And I know you are doing research on John Brown, that as well. So your stuff is always spectacular, and I always recommend everybody read Doug Greene's work, and especially this one. So lots to learn. So thanks for coming on, Doug, and hang tight. I'll say goodbye to you, but thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you again.